The winter of 1929 found Clara Doss 31 years old and utterly alone. Standing outside a bank in the town of Piners Bend, California, holding a folder of foreclosure papers that meant she would sleep that night, and every night after, without a roof that belonged to her. Her husband's cousin Walter Doss, who held the note on the small orchard she and her late husband had built together, had called it due the very week after the bank panic swept through the valley, not because he needed the money urgently, but because he had always resented that the land had gone to her and not to him, and he seized the excuse the moment it came. With the $11 she had left in the world sewn into the lining of her coat, Clara did not go looking for a room to rent or a train ticket east. Instead, she rode a borrowed mule 2 days up into the Sierra foothills to file a quiet claim on an old abandoned mining camp called Yarrow's Fork, a settlement that had been sealed off and untouched for 80 years since the men who built it vanished from the record books in the autumn of 1849, its cabin standing empty under 8 decades of snow and pine needles. Its very name a thing old-timers spoke of the way people speak of a grave they'd rather not visit. Everyone who heard what she intended called it a fool's errand, a widow chasing ghosts into a camp cursed by whatever had made 80 men disappear without explanation. But none of them knew that Clara Doss would be the very first living soul in 80 years to walk through that frozen camp's gate, and that what those long-vanished miners had left behind, hidden and waiting, would not only rebuild her own broken life but would settle a debt the whole valley had been unknowingly owed since before her grandmother was born. Settle in and let us tell you the story of Clara Doss, if you have ever stood at the edge of your own kind of ruin and wondered whether anything forgotten could still be worth saving. Tell us in the comments, because we believe the answer is almost always yes. Clara had been born in 1898. In the same valley she now stood ready to leave. The daughter of a blacksmith named Nathaniel Reed and a schoolteacher named Agnes. And from her father she had learned the particular patience of working with one's hands against material that does not want to yield. The way iron must be coaxed rather than forced. Heated slowly, struck at exactly the right moment, and never rushed no matter how badly you wanted the shape to appear. From her mother she had learned to read not just words but records, because Agnes Reed had spent 30 years keeping the parish register and the county school ledgers, and she had taught her only daughter that history did not live in memory, which faded and lied to comfort itself, but in the documents people left behind, deeds and diaries and receipts, the things written down by someone who had no reason yet to shape the truth into a story. Clara had grown up loving both of these inheritances equally, the physical patience of the forge and the quiet detective work of old paper, and she had spent her girlhood summers not with dolls, but at her father's side learning to read the temper of metal by its color, and her winters at her mother's side in the county archive building, learning to read the temper of a community by the documents it left scattered behind it. At 22, she had married Elias Doss, a gentle, sun-browned young man who ran a modest apple and pear orchard on the eastern slope above Piners Bend. And for 8 years they had built something quietly good together, not wealthy but sufficient. The kind of life measured in the sound of ladders against branches in October and the smell of cider pressing in November. Elias had no head for legal papers and gladly handed all the orchard's accounts to Clara, who managed them with the same care her mother had taught her. And it was Clara, not Elias, who had first noticed, 3 years into their marriage, that Walter Doss, Elias's cousin and the man who held their mortgage note through a family arrangement, had a peculiar habit of rounding figures in his own favor whenever he tallied their payments. Small enough discrepancies that Elias, trusting his own blood, waved them off as honest mistakes, but large enough over years that Clara had quietly kept her own private ledger of every payment made, every receipt signed, tucked into a tin box she never mentioned to anyone, because her mother had taught her that a woman who kept her own records could never be entirely at the mercy of another person's memory. Elias Doss died of a fever in the spring of 1927. 2 years before this story finds Clara on the road to Yarrow's Fork, and his death left her not merely grieving, but suddenly, legally vulnerable in ways she had not fully appreciated while he lived. Because the orchard's deed had been written, at the time of their marriage, in a way that gave Walter Doss standing to call the mortgage due upon Elias's death, if he so chose. A provision Elias had signed without truly reading it, trusting family as he trusted everyone. For 2 years, Walter had let the arrangement sit, perhaps waiting for a more convenient moment. And that moment arrived with brutal timing in the autumn of 1929, when the stock market's collapse rippled even into a mountain valley that had never owned a single share, tightening credit everywhere and giving Walter Doss the perfect cover to call in the note as a matter of unfortunate necessity rather than personal grudge. Clara had gone to him with her tin box of careful records, showing him the discrepancies she had documented for years, hoping reason and proof might move him. But Walter had only smiled the smile of a man who owns the paper that matters, and told her that recollections and homemade tallies meant nothing against a bank note with his signature and the county recorder's seal. And within 3 weeks the orchard, the small farmhouse, everything Clara and Elias had built, passed into Walter's hands. And Clara Doss walked away from her own life carrying nothing but her mother's old lessons, her father's patience, a tin box of useless records, and $11 sewn into her coat. It was in the county land office, of all unlikely places, filing the last of the paperwork that stripped her of her home, that Clara first heard the clerk mention, almost as an aside to another man in line, that the old Yarrow's Fork claim up in the high timber had gone unclaimed for 80 years and was technically still open to filing, since the original mining company's charter had lapsed decades ago and no living heir had ever come forward to press a claim on the property, the whole camp having been abandoned so suddenly and completely in 1849 that the county had simply left it alone out of a mixture of superstition and administrative laziness. The clerk laughed as he said it, calling it a cursed place, saying that everyone who'd gone up to Yarrow's Fork over the decades came back faster than they went, spooked by something about the empty cabin standing exactly as they'd been left, tools still hanging on their pegs, plates still on the tables, as though 80 men had vanished mid-supper and never returned to finish the meal. But Clara, standing there with nothing left to lose and her mother's voice in her memory, reminding her that documents never lie even when people do, heard something different in that story than a curse. She heard a place that had been sealed, untouched and unread for 80 years, and she understood, with the strange clarity that sometimes comes to people who have already lost everything, that an unread place was exactly the kind of place where the truth still waited, patient as her father's iron, for someone willing to take the time to shape it out. She filed the claim for the price of the paperwork alone, a modest $4 and a signature, which the clerk processed with visible amusement at the idea of a widow claiming a ghost town. And with her remaining $7 she bought rope, matches, a wedge of hard cheese, dried meat, a small axe, and enough lamp oil to last a week, and she borrowed a mule from a neighbor who pitied her enough to ask no payment. And she rode 2 days up into country that grew colder and quieter with every mile, until on the second afternoon she came over a granite ridge and looked down into a narrow bowl of a valley and saw, for the first time, Yarrow's Fork exactly as the clerk had described it, a cluster of perhaps 20 log cabins and one larger meeting hall, all standing under a heavy blanket of undisturbed forest duff, no roads worn into the earth, no smoke, no sign that a single living soul had passed that gate in 80 years. The whole camp holding itself in the particular silence of a place that has simply been waiting. Asterisk. She rode down into the bowl at dusk with her heart beating harder than the cold alone could explain, not from fear exactly, but from the strange reverence of being the first person to disturb something that had held its breath for 8 decades. And she tied the mule at the edge of what had once been the camp's main track and walked. On foot, past the first cabins, their doors hanging ajar or fallen from leather hinges long rotted through. Their interiors visible in the last gray light, exactly as the clerk had promised. A table set with tin plates gone dark with tarnish. A coat still hanging on a wooden peg. A child's carved wooden horse sitting on a windowsill, as though someone had simply stepped out to call the child in for supper and never returned. It was not eerie in the way ghost stories promise eeriness. It was tender in a way that made Clara's throat tighten, because she recognized in every abandoned detail the same kind of ordinary domestic care she and Elias had built into their own orchard house. And she understood these had been real people, not legend. And something terrible and sudden had happened to all of them at once. She spent her first night in the meeting hall, the largest structure in camp, sweeping out 80 years of pine needles and dust from one corner with a bundle of fir branches. And it was there, on her second morning, running her hand along the hall's back wall while assessing which timbers were sound enough to shelter beneath, that she found the first clue that this camp held more than an unsolved mystery. A leather satchel, stiff with age but intact, wedged behind a loose wallboard where someone had clearly hidden it, deliberately rather than simply set it down. And inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had preserved it remarkably well against the mountain damp, she found a journal, its pages brittle but legible, written in a steady clerk's hand and signed. On its first page by a man named Josiah Pruitt, who identified himself as the camp's appointed recorder and assayer for the Yarrow Mining Company. The journal's early entries were the ordinary business of a mining camp. Tallies of ore extracted, wages owed, supplies requested from the valley below. The mundane record-keeping of 80 men trying to build a fortune out of mountain rock, and Clara, reading by lamplight with her father's old patience for slow revelation, and her mother's instinct for what a ledger truly said beneath its surface, felt the same tenderness she'd felt reading her own mother's old parish registers. The particular intimacy of watching ordinary people go about ordinary days not knowing what was coming. But the entries began to change in the late summer of 1849, growing shorter, more guarded. And one entry in particular stopped Clara cold. Josiah Pruitt had written that the camp's ore, assayed carefully over months, was running far richer than the company's owners in San Francisco had been told, and that the company's chief agent, a man named Elliot Garrow, had been quietly diverting the richest ore shipments before they were ever recorded in the official company books, falsifying the assay reports sent downriver, and pocketing the difference for himself while paying the 80 miners of Yarrow's fork a fraction of what their labor had actually earned. The name struck Clara with a peculiar chill, not because she recognized it, but because of what the journal said next. Garrow, sensing that Josiah Pruitt's honest record-keeping threatened to expose the fraud, had begun making arrangements to be rid of the camp entirely, and the final entries in the journal, dated across 3 tense weeks in September of 1849, described growing dread among the miners, strange absences of company men who should have returned with supplies and didn't, and finally, in the very last entry Josiah Pruitt ever wrote, a note that the company had announced the camp's claim was being abandoned by order from San Francisco, that all men were to leave within the week for a new, richer strike supposedly discovered 2 valleys over, and that Pruitt himself suspected this richer strike was a lie meant to scatter 80 witnesses to Garrow's theft before anyone could compare notes with the company's actual owners, what Clara pieced together over the following days, cross-referencing the journal against a set of company shipping manifests she found in a strongbox buried beneath the floor of what had clearly been the assayer's own cabin, was a fraud of staggering scale, Elliot Garrow, had systematically underreported the camp's gold output to the company's San Francisco owners for the better part of a year, shipping the true, far richer yield downriver under false manifest to a private buyer, pocketing a fortune that, by Clara's careful tallying using her father's patient arithmetic and her mother's trained eye for a ledger's hidden truths, likely exceeded $200,000 in 1849 gold prices, a sum that would have made every miner in that camp, and their families for generations after, comfortably wealthy men, had they ever seen their honest share. Instead, Garrow had scattered them with a false rumor of a richer claim, and Clara found, in the strongbox alongside the manifests, something far more chilling than numbers: a stack of unsent letters, written by several of the camp's miners to their own families in the weeks before the camp's sudden abandonment. Letters describing plans to return home wealthy men. Letters that had never been mailed because the men who wrote them had apparently left in such haste, or under such duress, that their most personal words were left behind along with their supper plates. Clara understood then, with a certainty that made her sit very still in the cold cabin for a long while, that the 80 men of Yarrow's Fork had likely never made it to any richer claim 2 valleys over. They had simply been scattered, cheated, and silenced. Some perhaps paid off to disappear quietly, others, the journal's final desperate entries suggested, dealt with more permanently by men in Garrow's employ. And the county's old superstition about a cursed camp was, Clara now believed, simply the shape that a community's uneasy half-knowledge of a real crime had taken over 80 years of silence. She did not act rashly on what she had found, because her mother's old lesson held firm even here. Alone in an abandoned camp with only lamplight for company, proof mattered more than outrage. And a widow's word against a story 80 years cold would need to be armored in documentation, so complete that no one could dismiss it as a grieving woman's fancy. Over the following 2 weeks, working in the bitter high country cold with a discipline that surprised even herself, Clara cataloged every document in that camp, cross-referencing Josiah Pruitt's journal against the shipping manifests, the unsent letters, and a set of company payroll records she found in the meeting hall's own strongbox. Building a case with the same patient, unhurried care her father had taught her to bring to a piece of stubborn iron, refusing to let frustration rush her into an imperfect shape. It was on her return to the valley, seeking supplies and a way to verify her findings against outside records, that Clara encountered the conflict she had not anticipated. Word had already begun to spread, through the neighbor who'd loaned her the mule, that the widow Doss had gone up to Yarrow's Fork and come back with a satchel of old papers, and Walter Doss, hearing the second-hand in the general store, arrived at the boarding house where Clara had taken a cheap room with an expression of forced concern, suggesting that whatever old rubbish she'd found up at that cursed camp was surely not worth the trouble of digging up, that the past was better left buried, and that perhaps, given her circumstances, she ought to consider his earlier offer of a small stipend in exchange for quietly dropping any further claims of impropriety regarding the orchard's mortgage. Clara understood at once that Walter's sudden generosity had nothing to do with the orchard and everything to do with fear that whatever she'd found up at Yarrow's Fork might, once made public, draw a kind of scrutiny to old land dealings and old family fortunes in the valley that Walter, whose own grandfather had been one of the original investors in the long-defunct Yarrow Mining Company, would very much prefer stayed buried in the mountain snow. That single telling connection, that Walter Doss's own family fortune traced back to shares in the very company Elliot Garrow had defrauded, gave Clara the final piece she needed, because it meant the descendants of Yarrow's Fork's cheated miners were owed not merely a historical reckoning but a very real, very present debt, one that the current holders of the old company's dissolved assets, including land parcels scattered through the valley that Walter's family had quietly accumulated over 3 generations, had never rightfully earned. Clara spent the following month, working from the county archive with the same patient thoroughness her mother had once brought to that very building. Tracing the original Yarrow Mining Company's dissolved charter forward through 80 years of land transfers, discovering that a significant portion of what was now considered simply old Doss family land, including 2 producing orchards and a stretch of timber acreage, had originated in parcels the company's disgraced founders had claimed using capital that rightfully belonged, by every honest accounting, to the 80 defrauded miners of Yarrow's Fork and their descendants, wherever they might now be scattered. She brought her full case at last, not to Walter Doss privately, where it could be smoothed over or dismissed, but to the County Historical Society and the Valley's weekly newspaper together, understanding that a story this old needed public daylight rather than a quiet settlement behind closed doors. And the response: when Josiah Pruitt's journal and the Unsent Miners letters were published in careful excerpt alongside Clara's painstaking financial reconstruction, was immediate and profound, because half the families in the valley discovered, for the first time, that a grandfather or great-uncle who had gone off to the goldfields and never returned had in fact very likely died or vanished at Yarrow's Fork, cheated of a fortune that should have secured his family for generations. The valley's collective grief, buried for 80 years under a comfortable superstition about a cursed camp, surfaced all at once, and with it came a demand for reckoning that no amount of Walter Doss's remaining influence could suppress, particularly once the State Land Office, reviewing Clara's documented chain of title, confirmed that several of the valley's oldest and most prosperous parcels, including land Walter held, had genuinely originated in Elliot Garrow's fraud and were subject to legitimate claims by the documented descendants of the defrauded miners. Descendants Clara herself spent the following winter helping to locate and notify, using the same careful archival patience that had uncovered the fraud in the first place. Walter Doss did not go to prison, because no living court could punish a fraud 80 years dead. But he lost, over the following 2 years, nearly everything his family had quietly built on land his own grandfather had never rightfully owned, forced into a series of settlements with descendant families that stripped him of the very orchard and timber holdings he had seized from Clara, land which, once the dust of legal proceedings settled, reverted first to the miners' rightful heirs, and was then, in a gesture those families insisted upon once they understood the full story of how it had finally come to light, deeded back in significant part to Clara Doss herself, not as charity, but as fair payment for the work of an honest woman who had spent a bitter winter alone in a frozen camp so that 80 forgotten men might finally be remembered as what they truly were. Not vanished fools chasing a curse, but hard-working men cheated of a fortune, whose true story only needed someone patient enough and honest enough to go and read it. It is worth returning now to where this story began, to a widow standing outside a bank with $11 sewn into her coat and nothing else in the world, because it would be easy to imagine this simply as a tale of buried gold and just revenge. And it was never only that. Clara Doss did not ride up into Yarrow's Fork seeking treasure. She rode up seeking only a place to survive the winter. And what she found instead was that the truest treasure sealed away in that frozen camp was not the fraud itself, but the patient, unhurried habit of mind her father and mother had given her. The willingness to sit with an unread ledger, an unopened satchel, an abandoned cabin, and let it speak in its own time rather than rushing past it in fear or superstition. The $4 she paid to file a claim on a camp everyone else called cursed became, in the end, the price of restoring not gold to a valley that had plenty, but memory to families who had none, giving 80 forgotten men back their true names and their true story after 80 years of silence, and giving herself in the process not merely a home reclaimed, but a purpose she had not known she was searching for. Clara Doss rebuilt her orchard on the very land she had lost, planted new trees alongside the old. And every autumn afterward, when the harvest came in, she made a small point of walking the rows alone in the early evening light, remembering that the patience it takes to grow a good apple is the very same patience it takes to uncover a buried truth, and that neither can be rushed without ruining the shape of the thing. Thank you for spending this evening with Clara Doss in the frozen camp she brought back into the light. If her story moved you, we would be grateful if you would share it with someone who needs reminding that the past, however deeply buried, is rarely gone for good. And we would love to hear from you in the comments. What is a time you found real value or real truth in something everyone else had already agreed to leave alone? We read every story you share with us, and we are grateful, truly, for every one of you who returns to sit with us in these quiet hours. Until next time, stay close, *.